Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Arun Khuttan, who is a chemical and nuclear engineer who works in the UK nuclear industry and decommissioning. He's an active advocate for nuclear and sits on the Next Gen Nuclear Industry Council and is leading the UK YGN's, I believe that's Young Generation of Nuclear's, activities towards COP26 this year. Arun, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, great to be here.
So there's a little bit of alphabet soup in your introduction here. We're talking about COP, which I just learned last night, stands for Conference of the Parties. You're involved with the Young Generation of Nuclear, I believe. And you're leading an effort called Net Zero Needs Nuclear to sort of make a statement about the importance of nuclear for climate at this conference. Tell us a little bit more kind of about yourself and what's brought you to this point in life where you're nerding out on this and trying to build enthusiasm for COP26.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think it would be a nuclear themed thing if there wasn't that many acronyms. But apart from that, I think we're trying to stay away as much as possible from conventional nuclear type branding and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I'm very active in the nuclear scene in the UK. So I'm trying to get push nuclear. I've read loads about it, but it kind of started when I did my chemical engineering degree, and then we touched on energy, and I think I always wanted to be designing wind turbines, and thought that would be the way forward. And we did a nuclear energy module, and it just fascinated me, and I ended up going on to do a master's in nuclear. And I originally got into it because of fusion. I thought fusion was this holy grail that we needed to kind of pursue and throw the whole kitchen sink at. But after the first week, fission had already done everything I thought fusion needed to do, and I realized that we really just need to get onto that. And ever since then, that was about 4 or 5 years ago now. Ever since then, I've just been doing whatever I can to learn as much about the industry, learn what its kind of foibles are, and really, try to communicate out as well as I can that we need this energy source really. So began doing all that kind of stuff. And then came off my graduate scheme and got involved with the Nuclear Institute, which is the learned body and professional society for the UK's nuclear industry. And through that, I managed to get onto this Next Generation Nuclear Industry Council, the NIC. So we kind of mirror and challenge the UK's Nuclear Industry Council, which is chaired by a minister in government and has all of the relevant CEOs in the industry. So we kind of push back and challenge them to make sure that they're doing the right things and that they're doing everything we think they should be doing. And are they active enough on social media? And are they addressing the concerns of the younger generation?
Something I find fascinating is, I've got this podcast and I do a fair amount of advocacy around issues of climate, energy, and nuclear. But it's definitely not my day job. I'm just like, you kind of live, breathe, work it, and advocate as well. That's super interesting. I was just talking with David Watson. We did a show on the UK's decarbonization commitments, and he mentioned that the kind of dominant thing going on in the UK nuclear industry right now is decommissioning. What's it like, kind of is it a bit depressing, sort of that looks like the way most of the industry is going, or where most of the jobs are right now? Or
it is sad, but I think there's a silver lining to it because the UK is quite heavy on the decommissioning. So there's the 10 or 12 Magnox sites that are being decommissioned, and in a way it's quite good because it starts to build the skills for the next generation that you need in nuclear. Because even though it's decommissioning and these plants were built back in the 70s, there's not that great detail underpinning them and what we know today. So it is a huge challenge doing that work. But it definitely builds those skills, and it does look like the UK's going in the right direction with nuclear, albeit a little bit slowly. And getting the right skills is such a big part of it. And I think internationally that skills gap is really there.
All right. Well, let's move back to what we came here to talk about. So, I mentioned COP is Conference of the Parties. Every nation on Earth shows up, including Palestine and the Vatican. I believe the Holy See has like an observer status at the COP. So it's the whole world shows up, and I think every nation gets a vote, and they need consensus. But yeah, tell us a bit more about COP in general. And I guess COP26 in particular. Why you're so interested in having a presence at COP26?
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point there about like 99% of territorial emissions are accounted for at COP. Like there's over 190 different parties or countries essentially that are signed up, and they all have a voice in this. And it's especially the ability to give a voice to those more developing nations that aren't able to focus on climate change as much as they can. So there's been funds set up. I think COP21 in Paris. This is where the Paris agreements came from. I'll just go back a little bit more because the original COP was set up in 1995 and came from 1992, the Global Earth Summit, and that's when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was kind of put together. So it all kind of started there, and then you can kind of trace it back even 20 years before that with World Energy Sustainability Days and all sorts of things. So it's been a real melting pot, and as we've gone on, there's been more push to get dedicated as many kind of commitments into law, if that makes sense. And COP21 was the first time, so it resulted in that landmark agreement to keep global temperature increases well below 2 degrees Celsius. Each of the parties pledged to reduce their emissions. So, for example, the EU pledged to reduce their emissions by 40% compared to 1990 levels. And even last year, so the UK had they were planning to build a third runway in the UK at Heathrow Airport. And it went to the High Court, and somebody took a challenge saying, if you built this runway, it wouldn't be aligned with these legally binding COP21 or Paris Agreement goals. And the High Court agreed, and they said, you can't build it. So it really does help inspire challenge against these high carbon projects, which is a great thing. I think it actually went on to the Supreme Court, and they've kind of allowed it through appeal, but at least that kind of route for challenges there, which I think is a huge success.
So from what I understand, they set targets. They're not binding per se. I mean, there's like it's hard to imagine a global mechanism to say, hey, X country, you committed to doing this and you haven't, so we're going to punish you, or
Exactly.
Yeah, it seems challenging. I know there's been sort of, I guess, highs and lows. Copenhagen 2009, I think, if I'm not incorrect on that, there was no targets even set. There was, because you need consensus between all the countries for this final statement, and I think there was a lot of concerns coming out of countries like China and India who were worried about, not being allowed to develop because of emissions constraints. This idea of differential responsibility, that rich countries have historically put way more carbon in the air and need to do more. So certainly, not an easy sort of diplomatic venue to solve the world's climate problems, but I guess it's one of them, right? It's kind of what we've got to work with.
Exactly, yeah, and I think it is a lot about the developing nations, and the UN are typically neutral on nuclear, or like maybe slightly anti-nuclear, and they haven't maybe given that voice as much space as it should. And yeah, exactly that. The developing nations haven't had that chance to develop as much as the Western countries have, and put as much CO2 in the air as we have. So how can we allow them to develop without kind of completely squashing their economic efforts and everything going on? So I think at COP 25 in Madrid, that was the last COP it was 2019. It was supposed to be in Argentina, got moved at the
Chile.
last minute.
Yeah. And Greta sailed the ocean blue to go to, and then she had to come back. I think I have some good friends in Chile, and there was a major political upheaval there, having to do with the old Pinochet constitution and things like that. So there was huge street protest, and they had to move it back to Madrid apparently. So
yeah, and unfortunately, I don't think that, like, a lot of people called that COP quite a big failure for various reasons, but it was these national NDCs, national contributions that countries were kind of agreeing to, and some of the blockers were really like countries like Australia and Brazil
Mm.
as well as like the Indies and Chinas. But even they are kind of really setting the scene for COP26 now. We will have seen China pledging net zero by at least 2060, and all of these goals have been coming out, which is really pushing. It's kind of like it's almost like a race who can do better first, and it kind of
Yeah.
spurs different countries on. So yeah, a lot of good things are happening, but because of that almost failure in COP25, there's a bigger onus to do something now. We've had an extra year. COP26 was delayed. It was supposed to be November 2020, 4 months ago, and that's kind of how I got involved. More than a year ago, I was asked to lead these activities with the YGN. So we there's these official observers at COP26, and there's 2,500 of them, would you believe it? But they're having a bigger and bigger voice every time. And they're made up of largely these 10 groups, ranging from indigenous people through to environmental groups, youth groups, gender equality groups, local businesses, etc. So they're having a bigger and bigger voice at COP. And the European Nuclear Society, along with various other international nuclear societies and groups. There's about 7 or 8 of them are signed up as these official observers and accredited organizations for COP. So they have a direct say in the blue zone at COP, that with the legislators and policymakers. So we've got a real
So
opportunity here.
let's talk about this blue zone and green zone, because I thought this was interesting. I've famously in Canada, and I think there were these big anti-globalization protests in Seattle, where I think a WHO conference was actually shut down. We had a big protest at the launch of the free trade area of the Americas in Canada, and I think it was 2001. And so, I think there's been a move to sort of try and create a protest zone and an official zone and keep them really far apart. There does tend to be a lot of activism at these events. I think Extinction Rebellion has, I didn't follow so closely, but they were kind of occupying downtown London for quite a while. Is that what's kind of behind these blue zones and green zones, do you think?
It's a good point. I hadn't thought of it like that. The way I'd understood it is the blue zone is this UN controlled accredited zone where you have to have your badges, and I think each official observer has about literally a handful of tickets. So and previously this has been one of the issues with the 6 or 7 nuclear organizations. There's been about 20 people to represent nuclear out of 30,000 climate delegates. So that's like a tiny voice, which is part of the problem. But then this green zone, well, this year the way they've done it is it's largely UK government controlled, so central government, the cabinet office. Applications for that zone are more public facing. Potentially, yeah, that could be the more protest zone if you can get in without having a badge or a pass or whatever you need to get in.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a small bridge that separates the two parts at the Scottish Events Campus. So I think whatever happens,
It's it was just a theory of mine there. But speaking of protest activities, certainly there's a history of that. And I think this will be the first COP you've attended, but I've heard through the grapevine that I think from like Rowley Partanen and some others that there's been some, and I think there was actually in the New Fire documentary by David Schumacher, he had footage of, I think, James Hansen and, I might get it wrong, Kerry Manuel, Ken Caldera, doing a presentation at COP on the role for nuclear for climate change. And I think it was after the Copenhagen summit that Jim Hansen actually took a delegation to China and tried to sort of say, hey, China, if you need to go nuclear, like I've kind of given up on the West and on the sort of like climate activism in the West. Like, as a pragmatist, if we want to see emissions radically drop, like China's the place to sort of do this and lead this. And maybe because of their, central government and planning, there's more of an opportunity for them to sort of really embrace nuclear and drop emissions and deal with, also the health effects of coal and things like that. And I don't think it was a whopping success, but it was certainly a really, really interesting moment. Do you have any kind of anecdotes from people you've talked to, or like, how are you preparing for potentially a backlash that you're going to face from sort of more of the vanilla environmental movement, or the kind of the green? Yeah.
Yeah, there's bound to be protests, and I think we're just gearing up to get as many people aware of what's going to be happening in November. Get I kind of think of it as building an army of nuclear advocates that are like well versed in the terminology. They know what arguments to make, and that's why we've put out our Nuclear for Climate position paper with the European Nuclear Society. So that's backed by over 100 organizations historically. But yeah, there's going to be these protests, and I think Michael Schellenberger and James Hansen and various others did that presentation at a different COP, and they always get asked the same questions like, what about the waste, and you guys are
Mhm.
shills, and like, yeah, various events have happened. And I think in Poland, in Katowice at COP24 a few years ago, the nuclear guys were thrown out. They were thrown out onto the street because they were considered, well, they basically just weren't liked, and it actually garnered more publicity, and the media came to them outside, and it ended up being quite a good thing because got into the news, and now we all know what's going on in Poland. They've committed to building a lot more nuclear, and some really great groups
Wow.
out there.
Wow.
So a lot of that could probably be credited to what happened in COP24 and the intention they got.
So
So
we can make progress by getting thrown out. That's
if we make
that's
enough noise, then definitely.
I've talked about this before on the podcast, but and I think with Ted Nordhaus in particular, but this idea of kind of like heresy, for so long the environmental movement has had a real monopoly about their sort of dogmas in terms of these are the solutions to climate change, nuclear is evil, and when young people are coming and raising arguments that are not based on sort of economics or whatnot, but based on these environmental concerns, particularly climate, it can really generate some pretty intense emotions in people who have, I guess, grown up within the environmental movement, which kind of has baked into its DNA a real anti-nuclear focus to it. And I call it heresy because, I mean, it's, I guess, kind of an example of being sort of pushed out and thrown out on the street or something. Do you get a sense that that's shifting at all? Every year I think there's a bit more sort of grassroots pro-nuclear activities, and like, what's your sense on that? I know Zion Lights has made a big difference, I think, in terms of her campaigning and being a former Extinction Rebellion spokesperson. What's your
Yeah,
take? What are you expecting?
100%. Like, I can feel it in this last year. I've been doing this for maybe a couple of years now, and just in this last year, just reading articles, it's a massive shift. And I think, yeah, Zion Lights has been a massive credit to that. She's been amazing, and I think David Watson described her as a lightning bolt, which I really liked because she just kind of struck everybody, and everybody's like, right, we need to do this properly. And
Right.
everywhere I turn, there's some, like, this is the thing I find in people that work in nuclear. They know all of these things, but very few of them act on it. And that's part of our campaign. We did a webinar back in October or November called "Changing the Nuclear Narrative" with Eric Meyer from Generation Atomic, and it was really good because it just we did some polls, and it turns out a lot of people are willing to do something and advocate for nuclear if the opportunities to do that are given to them. If there's an
Mm-hmm.
easy way, and I think this probably goes for everything in life, if there's an easy way for people to engage, they'll do it. And that's
Yeah.
part of what our campaign's about. There's loads of stuff going on social media now. Net Zero Needs Nuclear. People are doing these videos. Just a 20-second video explaining why you think net zero needs nuclear. Tag 3 people, they do the same, and before you know it, you can have like this whole storm. And it kind of reinforces that fact that net zero does need nuclear. Like, it's not an opinion, it's a fact, and that's
Mm-hmm.
what our position. I'm delving too much into what our campaign says now because I'm
Yeah,
trying to
we'll get
give
there.
some
We'll get
thought to
there.
it.
But I do think this is a really important issue that you're identifying, and I mean, it's something I'm probably beating to death on the podcast. I'm not sure if my listeners are getting tired of it, but precisely this idea. Like, I think as advocates, we need to talk more about strategy, and something that I really felt was missing was that idea of really, again, we need to look at our base, and in terms of opinion on nuclear, there's certainly a variety of opinions, and there's very strongly held opinions on the anti side, and it's a pretty small section of the population, but they're really, really well organized. They have a solid base in the green movement, and they're able to sort of pull in skeptical parts of the public into their viewpoint, and then they're organized really well, and like you said, they make things easy for people to get involved with. They have the ground game, and they have
They have
they have a
money as
lot of
well.
financing as well to amplify a message, and that makes them not sure if this is the right phrase I keep using, but makes their bark a lot louder than potentially their bite, and politicians really listen to that. And on the pro-nuclear side, I mean, I'm really feeling like we need to mirror a lot of the organizational structures that the anti-nuclears use. I mean, they've, in terms of their campaigning, in terms of their petitions, various strategies. I mean, they've done a lot of they've researched what's effective and what's impactful and how to mobilize people. And so I feel like a lot of the work, in a sense, has kind of been done for us. And I mean, this is open source activism, right? Like, I think there's no, and I feel like that's a low hanging fruit. But the other big thing is exactly what you were mentioning in terms of what is the base on our side. I mean, it's people working within the sector who understand radiation, who understand the issues of waste, who understand, that their power plants put out no air pollution into the air, right? But that those folks have tended not to be mobilized for a variety of reasons. One of them, I think, is because of the stigma they face, and that kind of depends on the country. I think the most extreme examples would be Germany, where I've heard of parents who work within the sector sort of nervous about dropping their kids off at daycare and being kind of outed as nuclear workers. And there's this whole sort of issue that we play with where it's, well, are you like an industry advocate, or you're advocating for a technology or a sector or an industry? Are you a shill? And for me, really organizing the workforce gets around that in really important ways, because these are everyday people. And, when you can reflect with a kind of civil society organization back to nuclear workers that, hey, like, we think you guys are awesome. Like, you're doing really important stuff for the climate. You're keeping our air clean. And that can give, a bit of a sense of pride and a bit of more of a, I guess, an impetus to speak out and to get organized and to do these things. So, I mean, just in terms of like nuclear advocacy strategy, I'm super glad to hear that that's part of what you guys are up to. Let's, in the few minutes we have left in the interview, we talked about the campaign. So it's called Net Zero Needs Nuclear. Can you just maybe tell us about kind of who you guys are, what you're trying to accomplish with this COP summit? I gather this Net Zero for Needs Nuclear is very much a campaign focused on COP.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no point turning up to COP26 for the 2 weeks and saying, you need to listen to us now because we're here now. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done beforehand. So we put together, I mentioned that I got involved with this more than a year ago when we knew COP was supposed to be in 2020. But then we actually, when we knew we had more time, we put out a call for volunteers internationally. So we've got a really strong international team of 9 of us. We've got a few people from Canada, Brazil, a couple from Scotland itself, Wales, all over the UK. So it's a really strong team, and I love working with everybody on there. And we've put together this campaign, so Net Zero Needs Nuclear. You can go on the website, just netzeroneedsnuclear.com, and we've got a great launch video, which summarizes everything we're doing. So yeah, we've got a petition saying Net Zero needs nuclear, and that needs to be acknowledged at COP26. We've got our big ask for the policymakers, which is that nuclear needs to be considered as part of policy making and financing going forward. So that's kind of our ask and sits within our position paper. We've got a crowd fund for all of our activities. We've got the social media campaign. This is the big part that we're trying to make waves on. Is there's 3 different ways you can get involved. So take a photo or video of yourself with some of these Net Zero Needs Nuclear posters that we've made. Just post it on LinkedIn or Twitter and tag a few other people and ask them to do the same. If you follow the hashtag now, there's a few people doing it. Our goal is to get Bill Gates to do it. That will hopefully trickle down.
Yeah. What about Jim Hansen?
Yeah, definitely. Like even Greta Thunberg, if we can. Let's see.
Oh yeah, I mean this issue of winning the pro nuclear argument. I mean, so much of it is trying to bring facts to bear against emotional appeals, and that's such an uphill battle. But I think another really important part is this concept of influencers, right? And that's a lot about how we make decisions as human beings, is kind of looking up to leadership and who do we trust and what are their opinions. I mean, obviously, we all hope that everyone can do sort of the independent investigation and have the skills to analyze data and make informed decisions that way. But the reality is that we look up to figures with expertise like James Hansen, for instance. So.
Exactly.
For sure, I think that's a really excellent part of the strategy.
Yeah, and that's it. And it's kind of humanizing nuclear as well. You see these faces saying these things, or like with a picture saying Net Zero Needs Nuclear, and We had a few people post on LinkedIn a 20-second video explaining why net zero needs nuclear, and they've had over hundreds of likes already. And it's just, whenever you see a post with somebody's face on it, it's just proven that they will get more likes. So if we can like couple the two, we just need to start doing that and telling people, yeah, sign this petition. We've got a good few hundred likes now, but the Stop Sizewell C petition got like 95,000
Mm.
signatures. So we
Yeah.
really need to get onto those levels, and the only way we're going to do that is with this collective voice and getting people involved and on the streets. And we've got a huge raft of ideas of campaigning when we get on the streets. Everything from online game show events with renewables and coal people and oil and gas and politicians, and we've got a big strategy as well to. Well, yeah. Let me just touch on this because this is quite important. The one of the COP themes is energy transitions out of the 5 themes, and powering past coal is a large part of that. So you'll find the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and the UK and Canada are actually, and a lot of developed nations are mostly past coal. It's primarily for the developing nations to help them get past coal. And if we can go to those developing nations and say, we need you to recognize that net zero needs nuclear, and that will help you get off coal. So we've targeted a handful of countries that we're going to be engaging with their YGNs to make those meetings with their legislators that can say back to the UN, listen, you need to include nuclear as part of this strategy for powering past coal, because otherwise we can't be saying it as developed nations that we want nuclear. It needs to come from everywhere else in the world as well.
Yeah, no, definitely feel free to bring up, our little example here in Ontario where we phased out coal, basically almost exclusively with nuclear, 90% of the energy provided. I like to kind of hype my own backyard there, but it's a really good example to study. I think something that comes up for me a lot is this issue of climate debt and the need for the countries that have the technologies, the low carbon technologies, to kind of pay, and these tend to be the high emitting countries historically, and to sort of pay back that carbon debt by facilitating technology transfer. And you mentioned the financing. I think that's a really big issue because nuclear is shut out of a lot of kind of green financing in Europe. There was this issue of what's it called again? The taxonomy, and in sort of private investment funds, which are really starting to kind of dominate financing things like BlackRock, this phenomenon of, passive index funds and, these enormous entities that control investment in so many different sectors. And they have, socially responsible investing criteria and environmental social governance criteria to meet. And nuclear tends to be locked. Well, not just tends to be, I think is almost universally locked out of those things. We're going to have a show on Decouple in a couple of days, actually addressing that issue. But is that something you're trying to influence on?
Yeah, and again, I think our strategy goes back to getting the developing nations to say this to the UN and the big players in the world that we need nuclear, like figure out a way for us to get it. And hopefully that should cascade down to, right, these are the barriers as part of our ask. That financing is a big barrier, and that really needs to be looked at seriously. And hopefully...
Yeah. Nuclear is literally listed alongside like alcohol, tobacco. I believe it's either trade in live animals or maybe even endangered species. I mean, it's incredible. And I have seen a fund that was challenged on this, and they at least took nuclear off of that list when challenged on it. So that's, off of the sort of like, no, we're going to divest from, but not put onto the sort of investment front. So that's
I think that's
interesting.
it. There's a lot about just continuing that challenge, because at one point it's going to be the straw on the camel's back that like finally makes them cave. We need to keep up the pressure on these legislators and show that there is a young voice and there are diverse voices that are calling for this. And like we might not be the ones to get through, the next people might not be the ones to get through, but we also might. And I think that hope is what kind of keeps us going. And yeah, it's really exciting.
You got to start somewhere. I do think it's interesting, and this is just a little pet theory of mine, but the way in which the environmental argument for nuclear sort of emerged, and I'm trying to like trace the lineage, but I think probably James Lovelock, who's one of my favorite people in the world. He's 101 years old now, still writing books, and independent scientist, inventor of the electron capture device, which detected, could detect CFCs down to, I don't know, like 1 part per trillion or something, and really raised the alarm about atmospheric CFCs and damage to the ozone layer. And amazing guy, but he was one of the first sort of people making environmental arguments for nuclear. And then, you have Stuart Brand, and then Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus, and Mark Linus is another UK figure. And these figures just kind of opened up and created space, and faced like pretty massive social repercussions from their peer group. And I feel like, 10, 15, 20 years later, there's, the space that they've created has allowed for a movement to build, and we're seeing a lot of youth kind of stepping up to it. One last thing, I can't help myself kind of trying to give a little advice here or there, but a recent tactic that I did was, it's very hard for nuclear to break into the mainstream media because there do tend to be some pretty serious anti-nuclear biases. I know George Monbiot managed to do that when he was countering Helen Caldicott's claims after Fukushima. That was a big deal, but it's the exception, not the rule, that you get pro-nuclear stories for whatever reason. But I know in the UK, I think as in the US, there's many nuclear towns that are, off the beaten path, and sometimes will have their own newspaper. And because, they're from a community where the economic benefits and people understand nuclear exist, getting published in those newspapers is a little easier. And so, we had an open letter signed by James Hansen and a number of other folks and influential people within Canada and international. And we got that published in kind of regional newspapers near where the nuclear plants were. And that was just another tool to, again, help get rid of the stigma, shine back, reflect back on nuclear workers that they, have a higher moral purpose beyond just showing up at their job every day in relation to climate and air pollution. And, hopefully that's maybe an arrow in the quiver. Maybe you guys are already doing that, but I just found, in terms of, we're doing a lot of social media stuff, which is important, but that was just a kind of interesting tactic that.
Social media can't be the be all and end all. And I agree, like it needs to be, one tool in the toolkit. And we're looking at letters to various MPs and legislators. And we had a really interesting, before we finish, I made a video on what is COP on YouTube about 6 months ago. And one day a friend said to me, you've had loads of comments from Blackpink fans, which is a South Korean K-pop band.
No way.
And I was like, what? And it turns out that Blackpink had just done something about COP26. They'd gotten involved, and we had about 4,000 views from Blackpink fans, and all the comments were flooded by Blackpink fans. And they're saying, oh my God, this is incredible. Like, we can't believe we're part of this. Like, look what Blackpink fans can do. And it's just amazing. Like, and it kind of came back to just create good content, and then people will come. And I think that's kind of, we're looking to do infographics and animations and all sorts of informative stuff, but is actually engaging and is not boring. Like, not that all webinars are boring, but you kind of get death by webinar after a while. Like, how can we actually engage people on this topic? So we're really, really excited about
K-pop is absolutely fascinating. There was that Donald Trump rally where they reserved, almost all the tickets, and so instead of him getting like 20,000 people, he got 1,000 as a result. It's a really kind of new vehicle of activism. But were there comments pro-nuclear, or was it just in terms of COP education, that video?
It was mostly COP education, and then it links back to just the YGN.
Okay.
So, but we did do a thread on Twitter, which got about, like, kind of thanking Blackpink fans, or Blinks as they like to be called, and that had about 25,000 reach, and we kind of explained what nuclear is all about. So I like to think like at least half of that will be from non-nuclear people, and they're kind of starting to shift the conversation into different realms.
All right, Arun. So this was supposed to be a decouple short, usually 15 minutes, but I'm really glad to have gone over. It was nice to meet you, and cool to learn more about COP and what you guys are up to. Again, if people want to get involved, not just, I guess, folks from the UK, but around the world, tell us what they can do.
netzeroneedsnuclear.com, sign our petition, and check out how you can get involved with the social media on LinkedIn and Twitter, pictures and videos.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Thanks again for coming on Decouple.
Cheers. Thanks.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.